It's my pleasure to introduce the final session for today, and it's really an extraordinary one. I've been excited to do this because the commission's been so important to us as a family. As I look back on it, I think we were going through the free fall emotionally still of the loss of Brad. Mary started going to D.C., and I remember saying to her, boy, you can't fight City Hall, and, you know, we've lost a son. You're going to be down there all the time. Am I going to lose a wife here as part of this, what's going on? And, of course, she and a group of families fought the system and got real close with Governor Kean and the team and made it work. And you guys are getting to know Mary. She's reminded me about being wrong at least once or twice in the last 20 years. So, but joining us today, we've got Governor Tom Kean, which is wonderful. Phil Zillicow, who was 9/11 Commission Executive Director. Barbara Grew, 9/11 Commission Review. Carol Ashley, who we have known forever now, mother of Janice Ashley, and part of the 9/11 committee. Pound for pound, I'd put her up against anybody. And of course, Mary, my wife. And the other nice thing we're doing today is Bob Massey is here. Bob is the executive producer of a documentary on 9/11 that's been in the works for quite some time. And what's really special tonight, extra special, is that we're going to see clips from it. It's going to be released, I think, next month, Bob? November on public television. So we're going to see kind of a preview, and we got to look at it and pick the clips, and I think you'll be pretty impressed with it. So with that, I think it ought to be an enjoyable discussion here. We'll learn a lot, and I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Frank. Just a couple of comments before we begin. First of all, I want to thank Mary and the Voices folks for the privilege of bringing this to New York City at this special time. You'll be the first people to see any of the clips from this film as an audience, so we're very excited about it. The film is focused on the work of the 9/11 Commission, not on the attacks, but on what these wonderful people and the staff that supported them did. Tom and Philip and Barbara, thank you for letting me tell your story. I sincerely appreciate it. And Carol, thank you for participating. I appreciate it. I want to recognize one other person. My producing partner is here. Shelby Hiltunen, I believe, is right here. Shelby worked on this project with me for quite a while, so I just want to recognize her. Thanks, Shelby. With that, let's roll the first video clip, okay?
Up here, there, and there.
Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. It is beautiful outside, perfect September day with lots of sunshine. I'm going outside today.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
Oh, my God.
That looks like a second plane. This looks like it is some sort of effort to attack the World Trade Center.
Since my colleagues and I were appointed, many people have inquired about our work.
All military personnel in the District of Columbia are now on something that is called Threat Level Delta.
First, they wanted to know what led to the terrorist attacks upon our country, September 11th, that took the lives of almost 3,000 Americans. They also want to know how such a dastardly attack could occur and succeed in a nation as strong as ours.
There is chaos in New York at the moment. There is confusion in Washington. The FBI is already investigating reports that a plane was actually hijacked.
And finally, most importantly, they want to know what can be done to prevent future terrorist attacks of this scale.
There is panic on the streets, thousands of people running up Church Street.
And how can we make this country safer? And this is what our commission intends to do.
person who did not live through those dark days, one might think that the 9/11 Commission was created right after the attacks. In reality, it took 14 months of political argument and persistent pressure to bring it into existence. What was the trajectory of events that led to the formation of the Commission?
Well, it was difficult for a number of reasons. One was that Congress wanted to do the investigation themselves. In fact, they did an investigation.
Call the Joint Inquiry Committee to order. This is the third public hearing of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and
Families and most people, serious people, thought the investigation just wasn't adequate. They didn't have the time, they didn't have the money, and they had some political thoughts too. And that was the other problem. It was a year before a very important political election. The president, who had been elected and then subject to a court decision to confirm the election, was running for re-election. It was a very political time, and people were worried very much about what a commission might do. Congress, frankly, didn't want to establish it.
I served on the joint inquiry, the first look by Congress at the 9/11 attacks. This was the combination of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee bringing together witnesses and starting to gather the facts about how our country was brutally, viciously attacked on September the 11th.
Again, for Congressman Hamilton, with respect to the need for a creation of an independent commission, how do you feel about that?
I favor it. I think that I come from the point of view that we need more, not less, oversight of the intelligence community that is independent of the executive branch. And I think this committee has performed a very important service in the last few months and weeks, but I don't think you've finished the job. There's a lot more to be done.
At the end of about 6 months, having served on that joint inquiry, I found there were more questions than answers, that we didn't have enough time to look at a whole of government approach.
There's a lot of stuff in here, but there's a lot of information that's not in here that should be, in my judgment.
And I believed, given the shortcomings of Congress's first look, that we had to have an independent commission.
The irony is this. I can tell you right now that I don't know exactly how the plot was hatched on 9/11. I don't know the where, the when, and the why, and the who in every instance. I know a lot more than I did. But we still can't fill in a lot of the blanks. That's after.
We are coming out of a divisive election between Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush. That pushed us into more polarization and partisanship.
NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column.
We had constituents that were angry at Congress and angry at government, pushing us further away. And the Republicans, many Republicans, did not want to create a commission. They did not want an independent body looking at the Bush White House and potentially saying that there was some blame.
Governor Kean, you have been active in New Jersey politics and national politics for quite some time. You certainly have the perspective of the impact of Washington on the rest of the country. Could you comment on the rocky road between the attacks and the formation of the commission and how you became the chairman?
Yeah, well, first of all, there would not have been a commission without the families, because Congress really did not want to create it, as Tim Roma said. But the fact that the families descended on Washington and really insisted that there be an independent point of view and a commission formed, that's what happened. After that, Henry Kissinger was going to be the chairman with Senator
George
Mitchell, Senator Mitchell, and both of those had to withdraw because they had constituents or people who they made money from in their businesses, and they didn't want to reveal who they were. Kissinger said I'd lose my business if I told who the customer was. So both resigned, and Lee Hamilton and I were second choices. And we were appointed. I think I was appointed probably because I was the only member of the commission who actually lived in an area where the majority of laws were lost. So you couldn't live in the area that I lived in without losing friends. I lost some good friends in New Jersey. I lost one of my best friends, my tennis partner, in a plane in Shanks that went down to Shanksville. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I was picked. That and the fact I was a friend of the president's father.
Well, I think that your selection was somewhat providential. Philip Zelikow, you are a renowned historian and academic, and you have a specialty in the history and practice of public affairs. Could you comment on the machinations in Washington in that same period prior to the formation of the commission?
Well, what happened immediately afterwards was an effort to try to figure out what had happened. And unfortunately, because no one really worked it hard, the story was actually quite badly garbled, including the story literally of what happened on the morning of 9/11, the 102 minutes. For those who are really interested in going into that in detail, one of our staffers, a team leader named John Farmer, wrote a book called The Ground Truth that's excellent, because what happened was that the Air Force and FAA came up with an effort to come up with a timeline of what had happened, and they messed it, they screwed it up. And so even on basic things like which planes were where and what was detected when, the story was getting garbled, which then just made matters more and more toxic. The joint inquiry, basically it was a combination of the two intelligence committees. So since they were the intelligence committees, they only looked at the intelligence community, and they didn't look at the policy story at all and had no access to policy documents. So there was nothing about kind of the story of Al-Qaeda, the story of what had been done on counterterrorism policy in the years before 9/11. And so really the fundamental story overall and the story of what happened that morning was not coming out. And here we are, it's more than a year after the attacks. This is one of the greatest mass traumas suffered by the country in all of its history. And this is just a profoundly bad situation getting worse. And as Tom said, thanks to civic action, actually, and in my view, the statesmanship of a handful of members of Congress, like John McCain and Joe Lieberman, for example, without whom I think this bill would actually still not have been passed. The decision was made, all right, we'll do the independent commission. But of course, then that just kind of teed up the problem, actually trying to fulfill these enormous expectations.
Thank you. Barbara Gruey, you have a long experience in government service and the private sector, from deputy federal prosecutor to your current position in international strategy with the MITRE Corporation. Can you talk about that same period and what was happening behind the scenes from your perspective?
Well, at the time of 9/11, I was a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., and my office looked out on the FBI's Washington field office. So I remember that morning very closely, showing up a little bit late for the day and already a sign saying 100% ID check. And I thought, oh, is the Attorney General coming to visit today? Something. And then got upstairs and learned what happened, and then could see the FBI field office, what they were doing, and then all the rumors and things that were happening in Washington, D.C. that morning. We actually, from my office, we heard the plane hit the Pentagon, and we could see the smoke from it. And so from that point, I was involved working with the Justice Inspector General's office and looking at how the FBI handled intelligence prior to September 11th. And the story, particularly of Hazmi and Midhar, who were on the flight that went into the Pentagon. And when I went on the commission, I actually had a chance to follow up on those. And I had a personal connection to that story because a good friend of mine was on that plane that went into the Pentagon. And so having the chance to follow up and learn what we did and what we didn't do was important. And so it was just that IG piece was just one of the investigations that was being done. We had the congressional one, and there were many other agencies looking at what happened, what should we be doing, all those kinds of things. And it wasn't until the commission that was created that all of those pieces were brought together to come up with as complete a story as possible.
Thank you. Mary Fetchett and Carol Ashley, you both suffered loss on that fateful day. And before I ask you the question, I'd like to read two things to the audience. And I have to raise this to the light. Carol, you described your daughter Janice in this way. She sparkled with vitality. Janice brought happiness to her family and friends through her love and caring, her joie de vivre, her contagious laughter, and her wonderful sense of humor. Her legacy is the memories of the light, love, and laughter she shared with her family and friends. Mary, you quoted your son Bradley from a diary that he wrote that is just as telling about his character as Carol's comment. He wrote, "You can tell the character of a man by what he does for the man who can offer him nothing." I honor both of them and the others who were lost, as the Secretary did. Our next segment looks at what Governor Kean said earlier, the response of the families and their impact on the formation of the commission. Can you talk to us about your personal experiences prior to becoming experts in lobbying Congress?
You want to go first? Well, I was asked, I was very involved with a group of family members that were trying to sort out, the process for the families to apply for the Victims' Compensation Fund. And it was those same small group of families that decided, it was just us reading the newspaper and seeing, the FBI failed here, and this one failed there, and this one knew this and didn't tell that. So I think we started realizing the systemic failures that occurred. And as you mentioned, the Joint Intelligence Committee was meeting and trying to sort it all out, but we didn't feel like that was enough. And so we had a rally, and I was one of the few women that had lost a child. So they asked me to speak at the rally. This was in June of 2002, across from the Capitol building. I had never written a speech before, and I avoided at all costs speaking publicly, and I knew nothing about politics. Other than that, I was fine. So anyway, I gave my speech, and they had scheduled some meetings with the congressional offices. And I think it was at that point when we started going from office to office, and we met with all of them, all the congressional offices, all the Senate offices over time, that I remember thinking that they really didn't understand the scope of this. We had some offices say, you're not a constituent, and why should we have to meet with you? And then we had other offices saying that, one in particular that will go unnamed said, well, that was a New York thing. And, you're not my constituent. And I thought, how short-sighted is this individual to think that that was a New York thing when down the street the Pentagon was hit, not to mention Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So I think that the reality set in that we families had a moral authority, and we could use our voice to put a face and a name with the tragedy, with the hopes that our work would help make the country safer. And I know I had friends say, good luck with your little project. And I thought, my little project, my son is dead. What I'm doing now is going to save your son or your daughter or your husband or wife or sister or brother from being caught up in a similar situation. And I do have some props, but I'll hold off on those until you tell me.
Thank you. Carol?
In my case,
I started to read everything I could right after Jan was killed. And as I read, I had more and more questions. And I started to log them because they were building up. And I made a pledge at that time that I would do everything in my power to see that this country is safe again and to prevent, or at least minimize, the chances of another terrorist attack on our soil. So I wasn't active with Mary and the others in the beginning. I went to the June rally. I had met Mary at a conference, I believe, on grief in the city. She sat down beside me. It was really a fortuitous meeting because we became friends. And when I saw roommates too. When we traveled to Washington and stayed overnight toward the end all the time. Yeah, it was great, that part of it. So I met Mary, and I had already met, and in a strangest coincidence, actually it was a weird thing that happened. We had a group called Families of 9/11 out on Long Island where I live. And I saw in the Newsday that there was a meeting, but it was in New Jersey. And I said to myself, what? It's in New Jersey? I went. And it was for the airline families, and their name is very similar. So at that meeting, I met Sally, another member of the committee, Carrie, and
Steve Bush, maybe?
He might have been there too. Steve Bush might have been there too. He was one of the original ones, but he dropped out very shortly after I joined. And then another thing, I had met, two things in fact. I had met Beverly. She was doing a lot of stuff. I was there for the memorial, and I wanted to know what was going to happen about building a memorial to remember the people on it, because I thought each one is a person. I don't want Jan to be a number. So that was my impetus. I wanted something done to prevent this, and I was determined it was going to happen.
Thank you. Let's see the next video clip, which talks a little bit more about the impact of the families and the pressure that you brought.
We created the commission, but we never would have created it without the 9/11 families.
The 9/11 families are not concerned about re-election and pleasing our constituents. We are not worried about losing budgetary controls. We are not misguided by interagency turf wars. We have one singular purpose, and that purpose is to make our families, your families, and the nation safer than it is right now.
Their strength, resilience, tenacity, toughness, coming through some of the most brutal loss in their lives, they inspired us to fight for those votes, and we created the commission that then had to do a lot of work to get to the bottom of what happened and why.
For 18 months, our family has been denied the truth that a thorough investigation would reveal. As a family member, I am frustrated to have suffered the loss of a son and yet to be required to spend time away from my family and fight for the establishment of a commission that should have been in place on the day of the tragic event.
We saw this as an important goal right from the beginning. We realized that the government was not owning up to the mistakes that were made right from the start. And we felt that unless the government is willing to face the mistakes that it made, it's not going to be able to correct them and not going to be able to make people safe in the future.
We're going to continue what we've been doing in order to make sure that this commission not only finds the truth, but the reforms are implemented. We're in this for the long haul.
It's one of the great American stories, how these families transformed their grief into something very positive and decided, first of all, they were going to find out what happened. They wanted all the actions to why their families died and how this could occur in the United States of America. And so they were there to get the commission formed. When it stalled, they went after Congress. They appeared on morning talk shows. Some of them laid down across congressional offices so the congressman had to step over them in order to get to their offices. They picketed the White House, and they kept on going. And not only did they get the commission formed, but once we were formed, they were there for two reasons. One, to keep pressure on us. They wanted to make sure that we did our job, and they wanted to make sure that we were asking the right questions. And secondly, when we needed anything, to keep pressure on the Congress, so that when we needed more time or more money, the families were there. And it's an incredible story of positive resilience, and one that I think should be written, and I think it should almost be required reading. How only in the United States of America could this story have happened.
The families were there to remind us that all of that was just chatter. And what we needed to do as Americans was to come together, to put country first, and to ask the hard questions of people in the highest positions of government, and to get answers, not to just let the first response stand, and to push to get the facts.
Good morning. I lost my husband on 9/11. We lobbied Congress for this commission, and I've met these gentlemen. They're wonderful, and I'm really glad for their efforts. We know from current events how badly this commission is needed with all the terrorist threats that we're facing right now. Our questions as family members our first question is what happened on September 11th. The country was unprotected. All of our defenses failed. No protocols were followed, and we're hoping to get answers.
This is a classic example of civic engagement. I hope this is a story that is never forgotten. How citizens have some of these citizens didn't know Washington from Indianapolis. They didn't know the Senate from the House. They knew very little about the workings of the federal government. They dived into it, and within a year, they became sophisticated experts on the Congress. And they used that power that they got to make us respond. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. What a marvelous story it is of the American experience and how our government, under pressure, can work.
This collective grief that I think was really important to stay connected to all the way through the Commission's work, and the families did that for us.
Carol and Mary, let me go back to you two. Let's revisit this. You had personal journeys of learning in the wake of your grief. Can you talk to us more about the experiences that you had, the successes and the failures that you experienced as you went through this process?
Well, I think as Lee said, and Governor Kean mentioned, we didn't have a background. So the first thing that we had to do is buy Congress at your fingertips. And then we made every mistake. We were on the senators' only elevators and trams, and we'd be looking up to see if it was somebody that we wanted to meet with. But I think that what I want to give credit to is, as Phil said, Senator Lieberman was our congressman in Connecticut, and he and Susan Collins, who were head of the Homeland Security and then Governmental Affairs Committee. We've found people like them, Chris Shays and Carolyn Maloney, Jane Harmon, and others, that recognized that they had to put their political parties aside, and they had to do what was best for the country. And I think once we built the constituency, in a sense, we were able to convince the rest of the congressmen and senators to do the same. Now that wasn't easy. I think we spent 4 years in Washington, one to get the commission established. Once it was established, to follow it. Then once the 42 recommendations were released, to make sure it was legislated and then funded. So it was a really long process, and I know I used to kid Frank that I could have had another family in Washington because I spent so much time there. I think he came the 5th year, and they were surprised that I really had a husband. But I think that it was really one of the most meaningful, one of the most frustrating and time-consuming things that I've ever done in my life, but also the most meaningful. And then I think those partnerships and that bipartisanship carried on through the commission.
I don't have much to add to that. She covered most of it. I agree. I agree with what she said. We didn't know anything, and we didn't know that we weren't supposed to be able to do what we did. We went in there cold, and we came out with something that amazed us. In the end, it was satisfying to me at the end. I made that goal, that promise, and I felt that it was partially fulfilled when the commission was formed and they started their work. And then as the as they did their work, we did, as Governor Kean said, we did keep track of them and talk with them and keep everybody on course, or the way we'd like to see it. And most of the time, we came to consensus. The other thing that was interesting was working in a group where you had 11 women, very strong, on the alpha female continuum, with DNA leadership throughout. And when we got together and talked, we had to come to consensus. And we did not always agree. We had some who wanted to be more aggressive, and some who didn't want to go quite as far. And we had the goal. We kept that goal in mind the whole time. We are going to try to get this commission so that we can make America safer. And that's how we were able to come to consensus, even though everybody wasn't happy all the time. But we had to work together, and we put out stuff day after day after day. We were creating statements, passing out papers. And I go back to the Congress, in particular, I thought Chris Shea's office and Carolyn Maloney's office, they gave us tips and recommendations on how to approach things and how to move through Washington. Their help was invaluable.
One turning point we had too, this was another prop that we had visuals in front of the White House. Whoops, sorry. Even on Christmas Eve, we went to their Christmas Eve party and we're lined up. But we didn't go in, but we did stay outside because we thought the congressmen would be coming with their wives, and of course the wives came over to question us on, what are they talking about? But I think one of the turning points, we found that we had developed relationships where we're having regular meetings with the White House and a lot of these offices, and we were having a vigil in front of the White House one day, and I contacted Senator Lieberman's office and said, Senator Lieberman, we're all in town and we really need to have a meeting, because we had Nancy Pelosi's office calling and saying this, and we had, the White House calling, and everybody had a different recommendation for the legislation. And I said, we all need to meet, and so we're on the same page. And that meeting was a real turning point. We had the White House there, Lieberman, Shelby, and several of the main players that were making in a leadership position. And at the end of the meeting, we stood up and said, how can you look us in the eyes and tell us that there's not going to be a commission? And that was really a big turning point but it was just, innocent. We didn't know what we were doing. We just thought, let's get in the same room and talk about it. And that was really a turning point.
One thing that was a surprise to me was the resistance that we got. 3,000 people had died, nearly 3,000 people had died, and yet there was intense resistance from some quarters, and I just couldn't get past that.
Well, Philip, let me go to you and the theme of civic engagement. It was the middle of the 19th century when a French scholar named Alexis de Tocqueville investigated the American process. He wrote a book called Democracy in America and Other Things that was an outsider's view of the way we do things here. I want to read one note that a scholar made. At first, America appeared to Tocqueville as a series of contradictions, but gradually he saw that Americans were perpetually balancing liberty and obligation in greater and lesser acts that reflected self-sacrifice as much as self-interest. Could you comment on this historical process of civic engagement and how this bloomed from it?
Yeah, if you wanted a quick thumbnail portrait of why America is strong, instead of showing them a picture of the Capitol building, look at this screen right behind me and those organizations up there. That tells you more about why America is strong in some ways than that photograph of the Capitol would. Right now, I lead something called a COVID Commission Planning Group. A group of foundations more than a year and a half ago asked me, would I please lead a group to plan a national COVID commission? I gathered 40 leading experts. Our website is covidcpg.org. And I mention all of this because there is no national COVID commission right now and may never be one. And by the way, one of our members is a leader of victims' families, a woman named Kristen Urquiza. And she has been butting her head against the wall in Washington, and it's been very painful. You folks succeeded, and it's interesting why you succeeded, and they're failing. They encountered a lot of the same problems you encountered. This is a crisis now that's killed more than 1.1 million Americans before their time. And there are problems in both the White House and the Congress on this. And I mention that story, it's sobering, but I mention it also as a tribute to the qualities of you and the people here. Partly you were geographically concentrated, and I think this made your groups more cohesive in some ways. Their groups are more diffuse and scattered. But it really is a tribute, and it's this level of civic engagement in some ways is what is making us safer now. So if you go out to the headquarters of the U.S. Special Operations Command, which is in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and you spend time with the special operators, and their emblem, by the way, is they pride themselves, and their emblem is the point of the spear. But I just want to tell you folks here, you're the rest of the spear. And you don't do much with a spear if all you have is a point. And that level of civic engagement is what really is the power that makes these things possible. And sometimes we rise to those occasions and have it, but sometimes we don't.
Well, you all commented on how you had differing opinions and you had to come to some consensus, and there was a hammering, a commitment there through that. That was true of the commission, too, a very remarkable commitment to bipartisanship. And I'd like to show you the third clip we have tonight that discusses that aspect. And then Tom and Barbara, we'll come back to you.
That first meeting that Lee organized at the Wilson Center was a dinner, and we were seated, as you've just heard, Democrat next to Republican, and I was seated next to our friend Slade, who has passed away. And after about half an hour of talking, I said to him, my friends warned me about you. They said you were a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, that you would give no quarter, that you were radical, and that I should be very wary of you. And he said, my friend said somewhat the same thing about you. And that was the first lesson in listening. We did a lot of listening to one another.
I can remember sitting next to Jamie Gorelick, the one woman on it, and I can remember thinking when she introduced herself, and I thought, now there's a very partisan Democrat, but she wants to get this right. And she told me later, she thought, there's a really partisan Republican, but he wants to get it right. And the longer we went on, the more determined we were to come out unanimously. And in a sense, the easier it was to come out unanimously. And it was not expected. Mine would take far too long, so I will defer to Jamie.
Well, thank you.
I couldn't even ask the question at the time.
Here. Well, we all want to hear that question at some point.
You will.
These initial moves were all made by Tom, and it set the pattern for this commission and for a lot of others that have followed. these initial moves that Tom has described sound so simple and look so obvious now, but that is not the case. And it's had a very positive effect on government, I think, in general. The 9/11 Commission has been looked to as the model. It's the standard. It's the gold standard. And it's all because of these initial moves.
We would let the facts speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And if we did a vigorous, transparent investigation so that the public could see we were willing to ask hard questions of the highest ranking people in government and demand answers and not accept slow walking or other obfuscations.
Congressman Hamilton, what were your findings from the New York public hearings?
I think the New York public hearings were not in the nature of an investigation. We wanted the first hearings to tell us the story of what happened. Today, we seek guidance from individuals who can offer unique perspective and valuable wisdom. We will hear from the survivors of the attacks who can relate to us the awful experience of that day.
The story we told of 9/11 is so connected to the recommendations. If you take every one of the recommendations, you point any recommendation, you can find pages in the report and say, that was a fact, that's why I made the recommendation. So it was so tied together that I think it made sense.
What have you learned from your work on the 9/11 Commission?
Well, we're just starting our work, but basically what we've got to do now is, our job is to find out why it happened, how it happened, and hopefully to give lessons to the American people to make them safer.
It was to the benefit of the way the commission was able to conduct hearings, because we were able to talk with the staff that was most expert on whatever the topic was, and we had hearings that were substantive and much better than they would have been.
Tom, let me go to you, if I may. You said earlier that Henry Kissinger and George Mitchell were the first choices, but they were excluded because of a potential conflict. You became chairman. Lee Hamilton became vice chairman. And the two of you together made certain commitments that shaped the entire arc of the work. Could you talk about those commitments that Lee made reference to and how you went about it?
Yeah, well, the first thing, Lee and I had met, over the years, shaking hands. Otherwise, we didn't know each other. And so I went down to see him and talk with him. And I said something that Lee said was a great surprise to him at the time. I said, Lee, I'm not going to make any decisions on this commission without consulting you and getting your agreement. And I'm not going to appoint anybody to the staff without getting your agreement. That's the right person to appoint to the staff. And he didn't say much at the time, but later what he said to me was, that's not how the Congress works. He said, in the Congress, the chairman is everything, and the vice chairman is nothing. So he said, when you said that to me, he said, my eyes opened, and then when you started to do it, I recognized there's going to be a different commission. And Lee and I think the members of the commission thought that Lee and I had some secret agreement, and that we sort of agreed to never disagree in public. Well, we didn't have any, but we didn't disagree much in public, because we both decided this was the route we were going to go. We were going to be nonpartisan, or at least bipartisan, and that everything we did was going to be in color. So we didn't hire, one of the best decisions we ever made was to hire people like Phil Zellicoe and Bob McGrewy, because we said, unlike a congressional staff, there's not going to be a partisan staff. Doesn't mean that people aren't Republicans or Democrats. But this is going to be a staff picked on their expertise and picked on how good they are and that they're the best at what they do.
And if anybody's worked in a partisan campaign in the last 3 or 4 years, we're not going to pick them, no matter how good they are. We turned down 7 recommendations for council along the way because they've been partisan in some campaign or another. So it was a determined bipartisan approach, which Lee and I decided to work together, and we became enormously close friends in the process, and still are. But that was the idea. And by the way, one other important thing on the appointments, and I think this was by accident, but we were all what Lee Hamilton called reformed politicians. None of us had any interest in running for office ever again. I was asked to serve in cabinet by 2 presidents. I said no. I was asked to run for the Senate. I said no. I had no interest in further government service of the elected kind, and neither did any other member of the commission. So we were not immersed in the partisan politics of the time, which were pretty vicious as the politics are today.
Well, the term staff is not a good term for the almost 100 people who supported the commissioners. They certainly were the face, but the staff was the body of this investigation, a group of really remarkable people. And I'm happy to tell you that in November, when this film is released, we're also releasing a podcast where Barbara Gruey and her compatriot Mike Hurley interview their peers on the 9/11 Commission staff about the on-the-ground investigation that they did over those many months. I hope you get a chance to hear that. Barbara, you've had experience in much more partisan environments. Can you talk about how the leadership of the commission and the commissioners' cooperation impacted the staff and the work that you did?
Well, I think there were 2 things that I would point to that led to this success. One was leadership, and the other was the focus on facts, which was mentioned. You know, when you talk about sort of partisan perspectives, you're really talking about people's opinions about things. And one of the things that Tom and Lee, when we were writing the report, was take out the adjectives. Just do the facts. And so if you read the report, it doesn't say Bush good, Bush bad, Clinton good, Clinton bad. It says this is what happened. And I think it's very much easier for people of different persuasions to agree on the facts and then let others sort of interpret or have opinions about them. I think that that was important. The second thing was the leadership. The staff itself was a pretty heavyweight staff. I mean, we had a former Attorney General of New Jersey. We had, very high-level people from the CIA. We had, FBI agents who carried badges and guns and are used to, doing whatever they want. So we had a lot of staff who were used to being sort of heavyweights in their own right. And then you look at the other commissioners, and you had a former Secretary of the Navy, you had a former Deputy Attorney General, you had so many senators, congressmen, and the idea that somehow Tom and Lee could lead that group of leaders, I think is really remarkable, and I think that they did. By setting an example of how the 2 of them could work together effectively. That leading by example, I think, helped the other commissioners overcome their own sort of I'm in charge approach that they normally would take because they normally were in charge of things, and be able to work together. And I think that that is the most remarkable piece of this, is being able to lead other leaders.
Well, the friendship between you and Lee also spawned a book called Without Precedent. And we tried to follow the arc of the story that Tom and Lee told in that book in the film. There's a lot of stuff, of course, you're not seeing, and a lot of things that we couldn't do. We had these folks for 2.5 days in Bloomington. We have a lot of footage that will go to the Library of Congress when this is all finished. I want to show you a video clip, which is number 4, that looks at one of the more dramatic moments of the hearings and their reflections on how that impacted their agreement and how they finally came to consensus. Go ahead and play number 4, please.
Our next witness is Mr. Richard Clark, who served as the former National Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council. You swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, Mr. Clark, your written remarks will be entered into the record in full.
I also welcome the hearings because it is finally a forum where I can apologize to the loved ones of the victims of 9/11, to them who are here in the room, to those who are watching on television. Your government failed you. Those entrusted with protecting you failed you. And I failed you. We tried hard, but that doesn't matter because we failed. And for that failure, I would ask, once all the facts are out, for your understanding and for your forgiveness.
All right, so Richard Clark apologizes. He accepts responsibility. Then, in effect, he also blames the Bush administration. Did his testimony threaten to rip the commission apart?
I don't think so. It certainly didn't. It was welcome. It was extraordinary in its simplicity, with all the complexity that we were dealing with. For one person in a position of substantial authority to do the thing that had not been done in 2.5 years since the attacks of 9/11, and that is to apologize for the failure. No one in government had done so. And so I think it set it and us on the right course.
Yeah, look, I agree with that with you, Richard. I do think it was a powerful, unifying statement, and I do think it helped actually the commission to do its work. But don't forget that the second half, he attacked the Bush administration. He may have said we did it, but he separated the Bush administration in a hurry. And I had Democrats that came to me and said, Richard Clark's testimony is evidence that you should blame the Bush administration in your final report. We didn't do that. I wish Slade Gordon were alive for lots of reasons, because because my recollection serves that he objected to that at the time. And I think it's a good example of a statement that did unify us, in part because we ignored the second half of his testimony.
In spite of the partisan pressures that were building in the spring of 2004, the commission developed momentum and came together in unanimous agreement. So can you tell us how you emerged from the many difficulties the commission faced and how you came together in support of a unanimous report?
It's quite a case study in human interaction, because many of us, certainly I, had no intention or expectation that we would reach unanimity. But the process and the discipline that the chair and vice chair established of rigorously concentrating on the facts brought everybody's focus to the hard ground truth on each issue. And by concentrating on that, there was less and less room to disagree.
We have been remarkably unified and will be unanimous in our recommendations as far as we can see. Well, don't know for sure, but we've spent a lot of time together, and I think we're all coming to agreement on what the real dysfunctions were.
We reached unanimity not because we forced it, but because that's where the facts took us.
We did, however, make an important decision for anybody that's going through a similar experience not to allow minority dissenting views, which I think was a very sound decision, and I think it increased the power of the recommendations. Had there been dissent, people could have lined up with that dissent. So I think it was a wise thing to do, and it increased the power of the recommendations to the Congress.
Unless we had a unified report, we would have been thwarted in our objective. And we, each of us, pledged to put country above partisan intentions. And we accomplished that goal.
I think Lee and I hoped, almost from day one, that there was a chance of a unanimous report. But that's all I thought. Personally, there was a chance. And it was a distant chance. The odds were very much against it. And the gratification as we saw the commissioners bond and coming together, as we had those discussions in our meetings, and I saw the commission come together, it was one of the happiest moments I ever had, I think. Because you could see it, you could feel it happening. When it did happen, it was not only good for us, it was good for the country.
So was there a particular moment when you realized that you would achieve unanimity?
There were substantive differences, whether to have a director of national intelligence, whether to split up the FBI or recommend that. How do we speak about the Muslim religion? I mean, we had some big arguments that lasted a long time. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I would answer Chris's question, when did you know you were there? For me, the answer was at the very end.
The day when the question was raised.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right. But you know, consensus comes at the end, not at the beginning. The beginning is getting to know each other. The beginning is come to respect each other. The beginning is becoming friends with each other. Once you've accomplished those three things, the disagreements become much less. The agreements, if they're there, become respectful. Disagreements become ones where you can build consensus.
On the way from Newark Airport this afternoon, Shelby and I were talking to the taxi driver who is an immigrant from Ecuador. And he loves the United States. He's been here 20 years. And without prompting him, he said, "You know the reason that I love this country so much? It's so safe. It's safe compared to Ecuador. It's safe compared to Europe. I've been around the world. New York City feels safe to me." Now, somebody else in this country may say, how in the world could that happen? But outsiders looking in have a different perspective. These folks, all five, did very significant work in different areas that led to the fruit of this, which was not just a report, but 40 of 41 recommendations being adopted by Congress that actually do impact our safety and security today. Without directing a specific question to any of you, would you like to comment on the last segment or on the report or on Congress or some closing thoughts? We'll have one last segment where Lee Hamilton will finish for us. So this will be your last chance to give us a comment.
Well, I'll say something because it specifically has to do with the Clark opening. Because I talked to Clark on the morning of that hearing. Face to face. Clark and I had known each other for a long time, and we were not friends. We weren't enemies, but we were not friends. And we had had multiple long interview sessions, classified sessions with Clark. I had led all of those sessions, and we had gone through a lot of stuff. And some of them questions were were difficult questions. And Clark had, at that point, he had seen where we were coming down our staff statements and the report. And he then told me and told me later that he thought the report was factually accurate. See, the commissioners, as you heard, kept emphasizing, just work the facts. So then we have a staff, of course, 80 people, but the staff had to come to consensus. on what the facts were. And the staff, of course, is also very partisan. A lot of them, some former Hill staffers, people who'd worked in one or another administration, because they're experienced, expert people, but through lots of years in government, they develop very strong opinions. And as Barbara will remember, we would spend hours and hours and hours laboriously going over every single sentence until we felt we'd hammered it out in a way that everyone looked at each other and says, well, that's a reasonable statement of what we know. And so then you can have a situation where all of you can go out if you like and you can read the report and you can decide it blames the Bush administration or it blames the Clinton administration. It's kind of like your personal Rorschach test. But the point is that we worked very hard to get the facts right, and actually the facts, somewhat to my surprise, and then there are some particular issues here and there people can explore, but in general, the report has actually held up factually better than I expected at the time, because we were just human beings doing what we could in the span of time we had available to us. I thought we were trying to lay a relatively strong foundation that would then help people build further work on that foundation. I think quite a lot of the report, perhaps all of the report, still holds up today. There's very, very little, if any, of the report that I think Barbara or I now think need to be rewritten. And there was even a 9/11 Review Commission only a few years ago that actually looked at some pieces of this. So that's the point to stress, is that if you come into this with an approach of really caring about getting it right and not just trying to score points and play gotcha with people, and instead of kind of let's use 20/20 hindsight and see if we can play gotcha, instead we'll just try to reconstruct your world and what people knew and what choices they made and why they made them, and just lay that out there and then let all of you judge.
Thank you.
Yeah, you think about the report itself, the fact it was unanimous, the fact not only was it unanimous, but that the majority of the report was enacted by the United States Congress in a bipartisan manner. The fact that as you read the 9/11 report, it's now still used as a textbook in a number of colleges.
I met with students yesterday who were just,
Yeah, and but to put that all together and figure in all the time since, all the problems we've had, COVID is a big one, as you mentioned, it has been impossible for the Congress to once again appoint it on a bipartisan commission. It's been impossible for them to get together a group that would do the kind of work that we did. Whether we've come to a bad point in the country or what it is, but I don't know what it is, but it's sad. And the fact that of those 41 recommendations, 40 of them were enacted to make the public safer. The one that wasn't was to reform Congress. And that they wouldn't enact. But everyone else was enacted in large part, and the country is safer because of it. So I think there are lessons to be learned in the way we did it, the results of our work, and the sad fact that since then it's been impossible for the executive or the Congress to get together on that kind of approach to solve the very difficult problems we still have in this country.
I'd like to mention, from a personal perspective, I was in the room when you voted to unanimously adopt the report, and I felt like I was looking through the keyhole of history, and being there at that moment, even though I think we all sort of thought that everyone was going to vote that way, seeing it actually happen was really a powerful moment. But to suggest that had, as you said, that had been that way all along would be inaccurate. I mean, as Jamie said, there were a number of arguments. And I remember shortly before you voted, there was this whole discussion about how that August 6th PDB came into existence. And we brought the authors over to the commission's offices, And we had one Republican commissioner and one Democrat commissioner who were there for the questioning. And then I got to sit there and actually ask a bunch of questions. To say that immediately the two commissioners agreed on exactly what we would say coming out of that was incorrect. I mean, there was great argument about exactly what to say about it. And that goes to Philip's point of how do you get to the language that people can agree on and say that is accurate. And so even at that last minute, there were these kinds of arguments. And then a short time later, being able to say, yes, we all agree. I think that was really an important point.
Carol and Mary, this was very much a fruit of your labors. Would you like to comment on?
I find this very interesting, and I'm very happy that you were able to come to consensus, even with this huge, the huge staff. That too is amazing, that part of it. I wanted to say the one thing that the Family Steering Committee focused on was being nonpartisan. We emphasized, anytime we talk with anyone from Congress, we emphasized that this was a nonpartisan issue. This was an American issue, the national security of our country. And that's how your approach was more bipartisan, perhaps, but still, it's the same idea that we were working together. And hopefully our country can get back to doing that. It would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, I sort of go back to Brad saying that you can tell the character of a man by what he does for the man who can offer him nothing. And I think we had people step forward and did that. And I mean, what did they owe us? Really nothing.
Nothing.
And Governor Kean and Lee Hamilton were our true statesmen in every sense of the word. And their leadership, I think, set the tone not just for the commissioners, but also for the staff. And, I think about the hours that, we put in a lot of hours ourselves, but think about the hours and just these brilliant people that came together and really made such a difference. And, here we are 20 years later from the formation. But, I'm just so grateful. And there was not a happier moment in my life than when we had that event where you announced the release of the commission report.
Well, thank you. Barbara and Tom and Philip, thank you so much. Carol and Mary, I appreciate the privilege of sharing the stage with you. Let's conclude with the last 4 minutes of the film, and I think you'll hear a piece of wisdom from Lee Hamilton that might make you happy. Please roll it.
Well, let's move forward here to really the final question before us today. Here we are almost 2 decades after the commission issued its report. And the question for all of you is, are we safer today? Governor Kean.
Okay. Yes. We're much safer. We're safer because of our recommendations. I mean, that reorganization of intelligence is very, very important. But we can't let our guard down. We can't pretend that everything is fine. It's not.
Well, I think all of us would agree we've done many, many things to make ourselves safer, and we've been successful in many ways. The great unanswerable question is, what is the capability of our adversary? That's the key, it seems to me, in protecting ourselves.
Well, I would agree with what both Lee and Tom have said as it applies to external adversaries. But the hallmark of our democratic society has always been its stability and the peaceful transfer of power. On January 6, 2021, a stark reminder of the fact that democracies do not self-execute and continue as democracies without the support of the people?
I think that the two big lessons of 9/11 and our process are applicable here. One is imagination. We talked about a failure of an imagination causing the country's vulnerability on 9/11. Ensuring that people can see the threat is really important. And the second lesson, I think, of what we did is the importance of civic engagement. Civic engagement by our young people, by our average citizens, not the citizens on the fringes, average citizens, to protect our democracy and to protect us generally is absolutely critical. And those are the two lessons I come away from our great project with.
I would like to state categorically we are much safer against foreign terrorist threats. From every measure, we are safer. What worries me, are we the country safer today, is that in the choices we have been making over the last decades, we have been steadily reducing our ability to deter disturbers of the peace.
There's still plenty of problems in the world, but our mission was to try to reduce the threat of non-nation state actors using terrorism as a tactic, and Congress enacted most of what they needed to do to get that done. And anybody that sees it otherwise, I think, comes at it with sort of jaundiced glasses. It was a phenomenal accomplishment, and Americans should feel good about it.
So are we safer today than we were in 2001? Yes, so far. Now we're at another inflection point, 20 years later. What's new? What are the new threats out there?
The bottom line is Lincoln. Whether this nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
Yeah. You said it yesterday. It was beautifully said.
That's it.
That's it.
It's not written in the stars that we're always going to be able to do it.
Well,
it depends on us.
I wanted to recognize all of the commissioners. Richard Benveniste, Max Cleveland, who's passed away, Fred Fielding, Jamie Gorelick, Slade Gordon, who's passed away, Co-Chair Lee Hamilton, Chair Thomas Kean, Bob Carey, John Lehman, Tim Romer, and James Thompson, who's passed away. I want to thank you for your tireless efforts and for your leadership. I also wanted to put up the names of the family members that were part of the steering committee: Carol Ashley, Kristen Breitweiser, Patty Costanza, Beverly Eckert, who passed away several years ago, Monica Gabriel, Bill Harvey, Mindy Kleinberg, Carrie Lamax, Sally Reaganhart, Lori Van Auken, and Robin Weiner. And, it was quite an effort. Carol and others were big into research, and then we all had different roles, but I do think that as challenging as it was to have consensus, we were able to push the ball forward. So I really appreciate the time that we spent with them, the years of work that we spent with them. And then lastly, I just want to thank each of you, whether you're here in person or online, for joining us today. And thank all of our wonderful sponsors for supporting us. Certainly, I want to give a big shout out to all of the linked folks that came in from around the world, our Invictum partners that came in from around the world. And I want to mention you're all invited to attend the program tomorrow as well. Typically, it's specific on 9/11 issues, but I think that you can learn a lot about what those families, the responders, and survivors are going through, because they're really guiding our work, and they can guide yours too. So thank you for attending, and we're looking forward to next year.